All right, so essentially we have two important parts, two important data structures in PHP that you need to be aware of. Arrays are the first one that we have introduced in the previous lab that we are going to dive in much deeper in this video. And the second one is associative arrays, right? The combination between arrays and associative arrays, something like multi-dimensional arrays, is what we basically are being oriented towards. So when we get to the part where we deal with databases, the data that is being fetched or retrieved from a table in a database is essentially going to be having this kind of layout or format that is array with an array, or maybe an associative array with another array. So this is what we are actually heading towards. So let's just create another illustration and we call it illustration 2.php, and let's figure out what are arrays to begin with, and let's see in the next video the associative arrays. So this is your HTML document, and I'm just going to have an h1 and let's talk array. Okay, so this is how you define an array. First of all, you need a variable, of course. I'm just going to call it names, and I'm going to have brackets like this. This is how you define arrays I think in Python, in JavaScript, it's all the same in these three languages. PHP is no different. So I'm just going to say that I have multiple strings, multiple names, if you may. Oops. And these are the arrays of or elements of this array, right? And in Python, arrays are called lists, so don't really get confused or don't be afraid of the word array. It's the same thing. It's just a container for multiple values, right? Okay, so if you want to echo the values inside that array, the echo function is not going to work with you. So you need to work with a higher order function, something that is capable of printing arrays in a readable format, or implicitly it converts that array to a string. This is why you will be able to actually see it the way you're going to see it right now. So I'm just going to save this, and I'm going to go to my local host and open illustration 2, and this is how the array looks like. We have seen this in the previous video. So this is the first element, index 0, index 1 you have Muhammad, index 2 you have Omar, which is the third element. Okay, so I'm just going to add a small br, so we just have a new line, right? And let's talk about, this is how you can print the whole array, and let's talk about printing or indexing the array elements. Okay, so let's say that I want to grab the first element, so I can just easily say echo and say first name, or let's just say first element. Okay, curly braces, names, and index it using the brackets notation. So for indexing an element, you use the brackets notation, okay, like this, and just you put the index inside. Alright, so we're just gonna have a BR like that. And notice that if you took away the curly braces, it's gonna work, right? But whenever you talk about associative arrays, indexing associative arrays using the key of this element, because in associative arrays you're gonna see that you have key value pairs, just like dictionaries or objects from JavaScript. So using like the standard double quotes for this, it's not gonna work. So that's why I just told you that keep it simple and short, and just make your mind at ease, and just always use the curly braces. Alright, so this is gonna work for arrays or associative arrays without any worries. I'm just gonna go there and refresh. You're gonna see that their first name is Ahmed, or first element is Ahmed, right? Let's try this with another element. Let's say that I want to grab the third element at index 2. Okay, so this is the third element at index 2. Okay, so this is indexing an array. Let's talk about, that's indexing for sure. Let's talk about joining an array, or converting an array into a string. Okay, so you can join an array using a function called implode. As we have mentioned this function in the previous video, right? So implode takes the first argument as the join delimiter. Like, how do you want to join them? Do you want to join them based on a comma, on a white space? How do you want to join them specifically? So I'm just going to go with a white space. The second argument is the actual array that you want to join, its element, right? So I'm just going to pass the variable that contains the array elements, right? Which is in this case its names. Okay. Once you're done, let's use a variable for this. So I'm just going to say string version. That's a very long name of array. You don't have to use all of this. You can just use any variable name. So this variable should contain the joined version of this array, right? In Python, we used to have something like join, so we are joining based on white space, so we use something like join, and here you had the array name passed, or the list name, so this is how things were in Python. Now let's try to use echo here, and now you can use echo easily, since this is going to be, implode is going to convert this array into a string, so by the end of the day, this is going to be substituted with a string version, or the joined version of that array, which is represented as a string. So I can just use string. That's a very big name, so I'm just going to use the autocomplete here. Okay, and let's see how this is looking like. Okay, so it had like can join the elements of the array based on white spaces, or it put the delimiter as a white space in between every element. Okay, so if you want the delimiter to be something like a comma, notice this, it's gonna give you a comma between every element. If you want a combination of a comma and a white space, so refresh this, you have a comma and a white space, right? So this is if you want to use like a two-step of conversions. You can use as well, you can just include the implode within the print statement using concatenation. So knowing concatenation, you can do the following. I can just echo the following. I can just say array elements or, right? And notice that bracket notation and putting the implode here, if you put the function call in a bracket and the curly braces, I'm sorry, in this variable, it's not gonna work, right? So either you put this in a variable like that and just pass the variable name to the curly braces, or if you just want to make it in one step, then you can do the following. You can just end that string right there and concatenate it, connect it with another implode function. So this function is going to be returning the string joined version of this array. So whatever string is being returned here, continue the concatenation process and say something like, we don't really need to end it with anything, so I'm just going to put a BR right there, right? So this is the same, but I need to make sure that there is a BR in the previous one. Okay, so these are the array elements. Okay, now let's talk about the most important part, which is looping or traversing an array. Okay, so let's take the first loop, which is the for loop. Okay, the for loop in PHP is a little bit intimidating, but it is the same concept in JavaScript. Remember, in JavaScript, I'm just going to write this really quick. In JavaScript, in a for loop looked like that. So we said something like, this is the iterator. So we say I equals 1. That's the counter. We start at I. And let's say that we have an array that had a length of specific number. Let's say the array elements were 3. So we are continuing iterating over the array elements as long as the counter is less than the number of the array length, right? And we are incrementing as we go, and then inside the for loop we index that array with the counter that we have created. Okay, so that was in JavaScript. Okay, it's the same thing in PHP. I'm just going to go through this really slow here. So we start with a for, right? And we say in JavaScript, you say something like, you start defining the counter. So I'm just saying that the counter is going to start from index 0, right? Semicolon. And let's say that we are going to continue as long as the array elements, as long as there are elements in the array. So starting from index 0, go to index 1, go to index 2, right? Whenever you hit index 3, just stop, because there is no index 3, because we have 0, 1, 2, we don't have 3. So we need to know what is the count of the elements, right? Or what is the length of the elements, right? In JavaScript, you used to say array.length, right? So array.length was a property that is used to get the number of elements of an array, and we say as long as I is less than that length. So if the array elements were 3, then we are going from 0, 1, and 2, and we're gonna stop before 3 because there is no equal sign, right? We can put a semicolon and say that this is my iterator, then I is 0. Is it less than 3? If it's less than 3, then continue and execute the following, right? Then the second iteration comes, we go to the header again. Now I is being incremented, okay? So I is now 1. Is I less than 3? Yes, it is. So go and continue, execute whatever is inside the for loop. Did we finish? Did we reach the curly brace, the closing curly brace? Yes, we have reached it. So we go back to the header. Now I has incremented again by another 1, so I is 2. Is I less than 3? If it is less than 3, if the condition is true, then go and execute the block of code inside the for loop. Did we reach the final closing bracket? If we did, then go back to the header. Now increment I before you check the condition. I is now incremented to 3. Is I now, which is 3, less than 3? No, it is not. So do not execute the block of code and just get out of the for loop. Okay? So this is how the for loop is executed. Now, this is in JavaScript. You use the array.length, right? So in JavaScript, we use the array.length, right? In PHP, the equivalent for all of this is the following. First of all, you change the var. You do not need this var thing. This is not JavaScript. This is just PHP. The second thing, any variable in PHP, as we've said before, it should has a $sign. So we're gonna give this guy a $sign. There's an I right there, so this has a $sign, right? And this is it. Okay, so we're saying here the condition, the stopping condition, right, or the terminating condition, if I is less than the length of the array, so that's still this JavaScript. So how do we do that in PHP? In PHP, to get the length of an array, or the length of an elements of an array, you say the function count. Okay, so you say you are going to count the number of elements inside the array that is called names. And notice that I passed the variable prefixed with a $sign, because any variable, again, any variable in PHP should be prefixed with a $sign. If this names, it has 3 elements, so this is equivalent to saying I is less than 3. Okay, now increment the I, but notice I is still a variable, so it needs a $sign. Now this is the for loop. Once you're done with the header, now let's say how are we going to execute that. So let's say that we are going to echo all of the names by indexing them. So by indexing the elements, right, using the counter, which is basically I, the variable I that we have just declared, which is this guy. Okay, so now I can say name, right, curly braces, and I'm going to print the first name, the second name, and so on. So I'm going to grab the first name using names, curly braces, or square brackets to index that element to get the first and second, and so on. So this is the first, second, third, right? Or we can just say I, but again, this is wrong. I is a variable, so you need to pass the $sign. So let's see how this is looking like, and let me just, before I forget, I add a break here. So let's refresh this, and these are the elements printed from the for loop. Okay, so this is your for loop. The for loop is the old school way of doing things. This is the old fashion of looping through things. In PHP, there is another type of loop that you can use. Of course, there is a while loop, but I'm not going to go through the while loop. I think Dr. Yasser has mentioned the while loop in the lecture, so I'm just going to go through another kind of loop that is really beautiful, simple, and easy to use. And it looks like Python of some sort, right? So we can now use something called for each loop. So for each loop is much easier. Let's say for each name, right? This is the counter. Instead of n, we say as, right? For each name in the variable names. This is just the syntax. We don't need all of this, right? In the for loop, the counter here is the index, right? The number of the position of the element. So the I of the for loop, the normal for loop, is either 0, 1, it's a number, it's an index. That's why we are indexing or accessing the elements via the square bracket notation. right? But in for each, what you're saying here, you're saying that for every element, for each element in the array, the big array that is called names, right? I'm just saying name because it makes sense whenever you logically rephrase this in your mind to say for every name n names. I know it's backwards, but this is the easiest way to remember it. Okay, but don't write n. There's nothing called n in PHP. It's as, right? And this is the curly braces, right? The same thing that you used for. Okay, this is really similar to Python's for loop when we used to say something like for x in, for example, there is a variable called names, and you say something like colon and type whatever you want to type, right? So x here is every element. This is not an index, this is not a number, that's the actual element itself. So for every element in names, do whatever you want. It's the same thing here. For each element in the variable or the array called names, do the following, right? So we can do something like this. If this is the variable itself, or the value, right, for each name, for each value, for each element, which means that this name can one time can be Ahmed, the other iteration is going to be Muhammad, the third iteration is going to be Omar, right? So we can do the following. You can just say echo, and instead of using this square bracket for indexing or accessing element, I can just type or print the element itself, just straightforward like that, right? So you can just say name, and now we can just include that element without indexing anything, without indexing the array itself. So I can just say print that name, and this is it. Okay, and it's going to tell you the same exact result. Okay, notice that this is just a counter, this is just an iterator, so this can be essentially anything. So we can say for x in names, right, and you're going to print x like that, and it's going to give you the same result. This represents the actual element, so the element itself, while this, the I here, is the index, the number, the position of the element. So that's why you need to actually index the actual array, right? So you need to index the whole array. But here you need just to specify what is the array. So in my case, the array here is called names, and then just now you don't have the position, but you have the element itself. So you do whatever you want to do with the element itself of that array. So in the first iteration, x is going to be Ahmed, the second Muhammad, and so on. Okay, I hope this is clear now. So this is the for each. Let's see the activity that you had in the second one. It's printing course information, and you have, I think, let me just see this. So activity 2, I gave you an array called info, and it contains 4 elements. Okay, and I told you to do something like this, of course using a loop, right? And this is the second portion, the HTML portion, where using a loop as well, injecting the same stuff into a loop into my HTML document, grab these values or elements from the array and just print them. Okay, so we have so far seen how to, let me just go, where is it? We were working on illustration 2. Okay, so we have seen how to index an array, how to print the whole array, how to join an array or convert an array into a string, how to traverse an array using the for loop and the for each. Now the last thing that is left is to see how can we inject a for loop into an HTML document. So this is injecting or embedding a loop into an HTML document. Okay, so we want to do the same thing. Notice here that we have an unordered list, right, with 4 lists, right? And no, this is not the first activity, is it? Okay, this is wrong. I'm sorry about this part. We needed to have a list of these elements. So the first list element should have ethical hacking, 1, first semester, so on, like this one, like the PHP portion. Okay, but bottom line is we need to have one list element inside a loop, right? So every time the loop executes, a new list element is being generated. That's the whole. That's essentially the whole point of having a loop to begin with, right? So before we get to activity 2, I'm just going to introduce you to how can you inject this array, or how can you loop through an array via HTML. Okay, so this is the array that you are working on, right? Names here. So let me just go there and let's do the following. This is going to be confusing for the starter bit of this code, but once you get the grip of it, it's going to be really easy afterwards. Okay, so let's say that I want to make an unordered list, and inside that unordered list I want a couple of lists. I want essentially a list for every element. So I have here 3 elements, so I want a list for every element. But why would you do that if you know that a loop can generate multiple lists for you based on the number of elements that a specific array contains, right? So let's do that. Okay, now before we do this loop, I know that I want this list element to be contained inside the loop, right? So I'm just going to make PHP, right? And let's write the for loop header. This is what we have done in the previous lab. Now the choice of choosing whatever loop is up to you, whether you want to use for or for each. But for me personally, I see that for each is really simpler. So I'm just going to write the header of the for loop, the header here, this first line. So I'm just going to say in this PHP tag, I'm just going to say for each name, right? And this is the counter. It can be X, it can be Y, it can be anything. N, but instead of N, we use as in PHP, right? So for each name and names, right? Open the curly brace, right? Because remember, the header line has an open curly brace to indicate that there is an upcoming block of code coming or happening inside this for loop, right? So we end the first line like this, right? And inside the for loop, we write whatever we want to write. What do you want to generate frequently whenever this loop executes? Well, essentially, I want to have a list bullet point for every element or name inside the variable or the array names, right? So inside the list tag, I'm just going to make some space for myself and write the PHP tag like this. You can even make some space for yourself inside the PHP tag like this, right? And inside this tag, I'm going to echo the element itself. Okay, so I want to echo curly braces and echo the element. Okay, and we can write some stuff that is static, just a couple of strings or a couple of words before the opening of the PHP tag here. So I can just write name, right? The same stuff that we have written here. Inside the echo, when we were in the PHP portion, we've written name here, and inside the curly braces we have just inserted the element itself that we are iterating over, right? So the static part, I don't really want to include it inside the echo. I just like to have everything separated like that, because I want my PHP to target whatever being changed dynamically. But this is just a fixed portion of the code. That's just text, so why not just put it outside of the PHP port? Okay, so this is essentially your for loop. But there is one last thing. You need to close this for loop, right? So you open the for loop block of code that is being executed inside the for loop here with an opening curly brace. Now we need to do the same thing downside. We need to close this loop, right? So underneath this list tag, I'm just going to open another PHP tag and I'm going to put the closing curly brace. I know that this sounds a little bit weird, but this is how things are. Even if you highlighted this curly brace, you can see that there is a small underline here, and this underline is matching with the opening curly brace there. So it's telling you that the for loop that you have opened here has been closed down there. Okay? If you were thinking of nesting everything in a big PHP tag, like maybe remove this, right? And remove this. So everything is being nested in a very big PHP tag. This is not gonna work. It's gonna throw an error for you. Okay? Try it yourself. It's not gonna work. So let's go to our HTML page and refresh, and here are the lists looking as HTML tags, as HTML lists tag, right? So this is the PHP portion, and this is the HTML document portion. If you want to go ahead and try to execute this yourself, go ahead and do it. I'm just going to solve the activity 2 right away. So I'm just going to go to activity 2.php, and this is the PHP portion that you need to actually echo. So in the PHP portion, we're going to grab every element from this list or array and echo it like that. The only thing that is looking new to us is that there is an echo right there that is course information. It's a string which has an underline. So how can you do that? Okay, so that underline is really simple. I'm just going to write the text course information. Right? You are rarely going to need this, but I just included this bit in the activity so you can know that you can use typical HTML tags inside your PHP portion. Because remember, this is still an HTML layout, right? The only thing that .php gave you, the powers that .php gave you as a file, as a PHP file, is that now you can write PHP inside. But this doesn't change the fact that this is still an HTML document, right? So the same exact manner that we have been using the br tag with here by ending it or post-bending it or appending it to the end of the string, we can use any HTML tag that you are thinking of. So in my case, if you see here, this is an underline, right? So there is an HTML tag that you can use for that purpose, which is the U tag or the underline tag. So I'm just going to wrap this inside an underline. Note again that this is just rarely it's going to happen with you whenever you write your project or whenever you are working on PHP in general. But this is just something that I wanted to note to you, that you can use normal HTML tags inside PHP the same way that you can use PHP inside HTML, right? So let's echo the rest of the stuff. So this is really obviously that this is a loop that has a static text here called info, and the values of the elements are being changed based on the element inside the array. So knowing this, I'm just going to make a for each, and whenever you hit the template, it's going to show you so many stuff that you essentially wouldn't need. But you know that the first one is the variable name, and the variable that contains my array elements is info, right? And I'm going to leave value as it is. You can leave it anything. This actually just represents the element itself, right? So this and this and that, right? So let's say here that I want to echo, first of all, I have the static word info. Inside the curly braces, I want to print the actual value, right? And then I have a br like this. Now let's take a look at our page, and let's just go to activity 2. And here it is. There's a mistake here that the underline tag needs to be closed with a /. So this is it. Okay. So let's see how can we inject this into our PHP portion, or I'm sorry, in the HTML portion. So I've mentioned here that you need to create an unordered list, right? That has a loop inside. So inside the PHP loop, you should have a one list tag that is being generated over and over and over based on the number of elements that you have inside your array. Okay, so as I've just did from 5 minutes ago, I'm just going to create an unordered list. I'm going to create a PHP tag so I can write my for loop comfortably. I'm just going to write for each here, remove the unwanted stuff. Notice that this notation is going to work with you if you are using an associative array, but in our case, we're not really using associative arrays. So I'm just going to remove this and say that I'm going to iterate for every value inside my array that happens to be defined in my PHP portion as info. Okay, let me just remove this comment and let me just have this at one line like this. And then let's start our list inside that loop, right? And inside that loop, the static text here is called info. So I'm just going to type info before we start any PHP tags. Now it's time to start my PHP tag. Inside of it, we can just say echo and grab for me this value, this current value of an element. Okay, and essentially I think this is it. Yeah, that's it. Now what's left is to close the for loop using the PHP tag and the closing brace like this. Okay, so let's go there and refresh, and here you go.